Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today we're back in Blender 2 Train Sim tutorial, part 4 I believe this is now. Today we're going to be looking at how to texture bake and prepare your objects for export. In the last video, well in the last couple of videos, we've got to the stage that we've made our sign and we've textured it up. We've created the textures for it. That's what we did in the last video. In this one, I'm going to show you how to prepare your textures for export. So first of all, I'm quickly going to save this, because I should have done that before I started and I didn't. I'm going to save this in my temporary folder that I made earlier. And we'll go blenders. I'm going to save that as till close. And now I'm saving this one but not the other one, because obviously if I want to come back later and the name changes, I can come back and change the name on the thing. Whereas the last texture, it was black. There was nothing to it, so I didn't bother because there's no point, sort of thing. Anyway, if I wanted to redo the texture, I'll just literally go ahead and redo it physically. I'm gonna save this as well while I'm at it. Save it into the same place as I saved my last texture. Blenders. If I find, well, it should be just till close, shouldn't it? I'm pretty sure I just saved it. I'm gonna save it to match what I've just saved there. Save Blender file. Right, so in order to bake the textures, we've firstly got to do a load of preparation. And we might as well go the full way and do all the preparation for the export now. So, first off, we have a few main objects here. All objects which are related to the exact same colour or to the same texture can be merged into one object. And in order to do that, we're going to use Control J. So, we know that the same textured objects are this, shift and right click, and this. Press Control J, and now on the list here, not on the world scene list, these become one object. What I'll do from this point is what I did before. Control Shift Alt C, center of mass, Control A, rotation and scale. We also have this one, which again, we shouldn't need to, but I will do the rotation and scale. This object is on its own. Now, a lot of people, when they show you how to export into Train Simulator, they show you how to export a cube. A cube has basically zero practical use in the game. It doesn't tell you how to export objects with multiple bits and more purpose and all that. The aim of my tutorial here is to show you how to export a model that's actually got a purpose to it. A cube is just a test object, generally. There's not very many times where you're going to use a cube in a practical sense. So here I'm going to show you how to export two or more objects together. So any objects that use the same texture, they can all be grouped using Control J. If I want to ungroup them because I realise I made a mistake, I can go into edit mode, click on an object, press L, press P, press selection, and then you can see that's now a separate object. It will still have the same origin points as what it had before, so I'd want to go and do that. Control C, Control Shift Alt C, Control A, and that gives it its own identity again. I'm going to undo all that because we don't need it. We need it like as an object. Now, the naming. Train Simulator has very specific ways which objects need to be named. So, Train Simulator requires some very specific naming patterns in order to be able to name an object as a specific name. So, if we go up here, double click on the object, that'll let you name it. We're going to start off with a 1. The 1 is the level of detail. I just had to double check this because I couldn't remember what it means, because it means so little overall. I believe for bigger models, this 1 probably changes and gets less and stuff. So I assume that more advanced modelers, if you will, would rely on this one before. For now, you don't really need to. You just need to know it correlates to the level of detail, and the number is 1. Like I say, I just had to check on the tutorial from trainsimdev.com in order to remind myself what that number was, because of how insignificant it is to me. But 1 is your level of detail. You're then going to want an underscore, followed by 4 digits. These 4 digits are important. This is the distance which you want your object to be seen at. It has to be 4 digits. It works in meters. If you want to be able to see your object at 20 meters, but you can't see it any further away, then you type 0020. 500 meters, you type 0500. Normally, I tend to set my objects to 1,000. Why would you want your objects to not be seen from a distance? Well, if it's a small object like this, there's no point in seeing an object so tiny from 20 miles away, sort of thing. There's just no point in having that object. If you have a really tall tower block in the distance, such as the Shard, the Gherkin, Canary Wharf, all of them big tall buildings that dominate the skyline, you're going to want to have them to be seen from a very long way away. But a little tree, or, a sign, you're not going to see very far away. So therefore, this sort of depends on the asset you're making. Also, different parts of assets. So, for example, if I've got a building, but then I've got a door on it, for example, or even the hinges on that door. The building I want to be seen from a significantly further away distance than the hinges on that door. So the hinges will have a much lower number for the distance than the door. And it's just to help your game run better. If you're having everything for every object loaded all the time, then your game's going to struggle and it's going to slow down a bit. Obviously, with 4 digits, the maximum you can go to is 9999 meters. There may be a way around it. I'm not aware of it, but who knows. So that's what that means. Next off is the name of your object. This bit is completely irrelevant to the actual object itself. It's literally just a name of the object that makes you recognise what it is. So for this, I'm going to name it poles. Because this object mostly relates to the actual poles themselves. Obviously, you've got that black bar across the front. But mostly it's the poles. I'm going to press enter, and that's that named. There are other things you can do with the names, but I'll go through them in a different video. I want to make some more videos covering how to make lights, how to make animated objects, how to make all sorts of silly stuff, that I've learnt across the way. I want to try and bring as much as I can to the table. When I started modelling, there wasn't a lot of tutorials, and there was even less decent ones. I used Train Sim Dev's tutorial on how to make a 2D tree, which I will link in the description, of course. Huge shout out to him. Without him, I would not have known the slightest clue of how to do any of this. But I've always wanted to create these tutorials to show you actually what the purpose of Blender and all of this stuff is and how you can use it. Anyway, for the sign, I'm going to name it 1_1000_. And then I'll probably name this just simply sign. Because that's all it is. It's just the sign. Next off, we want to create material. A material allows you to be able to see the object in-game. Going to go to the materials section, which is this red sort of ball. We've already got a material ready for us. So I'm going to rename this. Now, something I've always stuck with, that doesn't actually matter. I always name my stuff Matt_. Again, this is something from Train Sim Dev. Again, a link in the description. He always puts Matt_ because it helps you to identify what bits are the materials and what bits are the objects. It just makes it slightly easier to work it out. Generally, I'll name the material, or I'll try and name the material as close to the name of the actual object as I can. So in this case, I'll name it Matt_poles. Shade, we want to put it square, flat, shadeless. We don't need any transparency for this object because we're not going to make it see-through. The main ones are this and this. These don't actually have any physical inclination towards the game. It's just to show it in Blender. So if you're not doing these two, it doesn't actually make a difference as far as Blender's concerned, as far as Train Sim's concerned. But Blender, you may see some interesting effects. Next off, there's already a material in there. That's fun. Next off, you'll probably look like this. in the texture section. First off, you want to do, you want to add a shader. Now, shader defines how the object appears in game. Whether it glows, whether it responds to light, whether it constantly stares you in the face. There's a lot. Shaders are half of how a model looks in game. So if it's glass, you want to use a glass shader. For now, we're just going to make a regular object shader. We want to select the type as none, and our shader is going to be called TRDiff. TRDiff with a capital T and a capital diff. That's it, a capital D, sorry. A capital T and a capital D. That's all you need. Next up, we want to add our actual texture. Now, our texture, temporarily, is this grey texture. So if I open that, I go to Textures, Black, Orig, and there we go. There's our basic texture. Again, copy that for this object. Material, matte, underscore, sign. Do that. Flat, shadeless, texture. Now, if I add and do that and make it TRDiff, you'll notice it becomes TRDiff 001. The game does not recognize this as a shader. What you need to do for the shaders themselves is actually come to the scroll down menu and click on TRDiff. That ensures that both of these are using the correct shader. For the textures, if I wanted to use the same texture, I would probably do the same thing for this. In this case, I don't want to use the same texture, so I'll click New, Open, Textures, Sign Original, and there we go. Nothing else that needs to be done at this moment in time in these sections. Next off, pretty much what we've got here is an object that is ready to be exported into Train Simulator. There is one more step which you need to do if you want to export this into Train Simulator at this moment in time. And then you can do Export Text, click that, do that, and add the exact same texture that you've related to this one. This texture at the bottom, well, I say it's at the bottom. This IGS export config might not always be at the bottom. It moves around quite heavily. I've seen it up the top, and I've seen it in the middle, and all sorts of places. So don't expect it to be at the bottom. Just have a look for IGS export config. This technically is ready to export. But like I say, we want to bake it really. They look better baked textures. So the next step is to create a secondary mapping for our texture. To do that, we go into this object here. UV maps, press the plus icon. Simply all I'm going to do now, go back into my object. We already know it's centered. Smart UV, unwrap. You'll notice we have a mess of textures. That's absolutely fine. Next off, new image. 1024 by 1024 is usually the standard. I would recommend using that, unless you've got a small object. For this, we may get away with a smaller texture size. So let's have a go with a smaller texture size, shall we? 512 by 512. We want to make it square. As square as possible. And there we go. We have a blank texture ready for baking. Next step is to actually bake the texture, which, as long as you've got this texture in here, ready and set up, you should be good. Click the camera icon. Go to the section at the bottom where it says bake and hit the drop down menu. What you want to do, textures, I believe you need to bake shading on surface selected objects, to active objects. I'm pretty sure that's the one you want to tick. If you don't tick that, you'll get two very different bakes when we do the ambient occlusion, and I'll show you the difference between the two. Firstly, let's bake our texture. That sorts that out. Also, you can see how there's quite an overhang from this. You can change the margin by changing that there. And now we've got a significantly lower overhang. I recommend you have at least an overhang of 1 pixel. Because if you have 0 pixels, and you've got sections like this, you may find that some of your UV map is not actually on part of the texture. So yeah, make sure it's at least one, I recommend, of an overhang, so that you've got something to rely on, just in case. Come down to image, save a copy, find your thingy. Sometimes, if I'm using a lot of textures, I will go into here, new folder, and I'll just make a bakes folder. That's not necessary, it's just something I do, just to organise them better. Next off, I'll name this number 1. And I'll explain why I name it 1 and not something more relevant. The next step is to do an ambient occlusion bake. Now, ambient occlusion is not actually something that exists in real life. Basically what this does is it fakes light hitting different surfaces. It means that if you've got a section in here, you actually get a sort of a darker outline to this section than you would if you just bake it normally. And I'll show you the difference. There you go. Do you see? You've got your dark, sort of your dark area of where it is. And I believe you deselect that. That's the normal. Yeah, you have to deselect this one. I couldn't remember whether it was selected or deselected. Doesn't matter for the texture slot. Just matters for the ambient occlusion. Now you can see, if I go back into edit mode, you can see we've got shadows around everything. Don't bake to vertexes, because that seems to break. I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of vertex baking is for, but just don't use it. Once we've got this, I'll go back, save this as number 2. Now, the reason why I named the last one as number 1, and now I've named this as number 2, is because it's effortless. I know that if I name this 1 and the next one 2, that means that I know number 1 and 2 to go together. Our next ones, I will name 3 and 4. And then, if I've got any more textures, I'll name 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It's effortless. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to write anything long-winded. And it's easy to work out which ones go with which, because you just use the one that follows. Odd first, even second. It's simple. What I'll do now, normally I'd bake everything, but I'll show you how we put it together. Multiply, go into here. You want to select it, drag both surfaces in, drag both textures in, select multiply, and that will turn it from that into something that you can see what's the textures underneath. It will become more apparent when I bake the second texture. What I'll do now, export as, go back to textures, and I'll name this something properly. So, our materials, for example, are called poles. I shall actually name this in correspondence, poles.png. And that means that it's going to be easy to see which ones correlate to which object. Same story with this. What I'm going to do, go into there. Now, bit of a tip with these. What I normally do when I'm baking, if I've actually got a texture like this, that's sort of nicely done and everything, if I've got space, I'll actually leave it alone when I bake, when I sort out my next textures. Because if you unwrap, you'll see that the area... Oh, hang on. I need to go back and apply the rotation scale. That's why that came out funny. Or it should be. You'll see the area which I've got is a really funny shape, and it's going to mess up all of the texture, and it's not going to look very nice. So, what I generally tend to do, leave that out of it, and just unwrap everything else that isn't involved in it. Now what I'll do, I'll rotate them by 90. I'll make them by 2. I'll multiply that by 2. Center that best I can. Make sure it is actually within the limits of my texture. That will do nicely. Shrink it down. Now it might affect how the textures look slightly. They might look a bit stretched and all that, but it doesn't really make much of a difference. And you'll see we've actually got our actual sign that we want to keep the same, looking the same. Now all I'll do is I'll make a 1024 by 512 texture. Bake the textures. I normally bake the textures properly because it helps me keep track of what I'm doing. Bake the textures. Number 3. Ambient Occlusion bake. Number 4. Before we do anything else, though, I'm going to go back to this. So we made a 525 by 512 by 512. If I make a 1024 by 1024, it should be reasonably obvious. But you'll see the quality is better. It's less pixelated. So that's the difference between having a smaller texture and a larger texture. It just helps you do anything. I'm going to stick with the 512 by 512, I reckon, because it's good enough for me. Again, multiply that. Export as. Bakes. I'm going to name that sign, but get rid of the orig, so it's just called sign. You see why I had orig now? Because sometimes the names overlap each other, and therefore you're going to want to make sure there is a difference between the names so that they don't clash. Poles. We swap that texture out. We swap this texture out. Again, go onto there. Swap the texture out in the texture section. Swap the texture out in the mapping. That's the wrong texture. And there we go. That is our finished road sign. All we've got to do now, change these IGS exports to sign and poles respectively, and that's everything ready to go. We are now ready to export our objects. It has been built, it has been textured, it has been baked. We are ready to put this thing into the game. So join me in the next and final video of the base series of this. Remember, I will be doing more Blender to Train Sim tutorials, but they'll be sort of as and when I can do them. I just want to show you how to create a basic texture, a basic model at first. From this, you should be able to work out reasonably easy how to sort of make bigger and more impressive models. But yeah, anyway, I'm going to leave that there. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. And I will see you all next time. Goodbye!